Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Anna Sale. Anna is a journalist, and she's a host of the award-winning podcast called Death, Sex, and Money. It's got the tagline, a show about the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. This was a lovely conversation with Anna. I mean, I don't know if lovely is the right adjective since you're talking about death, sex, and money, but it was a fascinating conversation with Anna. We talked a lot about having hard conversations, how to have some hard conversations, and things that she's learned about death, sex, and money, and the conversations that she's had about those topics through the years. Wonderful conversation. Enjoy. Here's Anna Sale. Anna Sale is the creator and host of Death, Sex, and Money, a podcast about the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. Since its debut at the top of the iTunes chart in 2014, the show was named the #1 podcast of the year by New York Magazine and has won leading podcast industry awards, a Gracie, a Webby, and Amby, and she is the author of Let's Talk About Hard Things. Welcome, Anna Sale.
Thank you for having me.
Pleased to have you, and pleased to see you with your Country Music Hall of Fame shirt on.
That's right. I put it on for the occasion.
Yeah, and born in Nashville, Tennessee.
That's right. I have so much affection for Nashville, even though I only lived there for 3 months before my parents moved our family away. But I love Nashville.
Nashville's a lovely city. Yeah, I've spent most of my life here and love it. It's great. So you should come back more often and visit more often. So, But grateful to be with you today. So there's this saying in academia sometimes where people will say research is me search, and that if you look at people's academic lives and you dig into their autobiography, you can find some sort of link typically between the things that they want to talk about over and over again and study and lecture on over and over again, and something that's happened in their life. And so I was just wondering, for you who have been so invested in helping us have hard conversations and learn about the skills necessary to have hard conversations, what would you identify as the elements in your own story that have led you to where you are these days?
My me search. I like that. I think in the case of my interest, it's less about, when I think back, less about trying to kind of scratch and get at something that I've been after my whole life, and more about this was what was modeled to me, being in a family of a lot of sisters, parents who were in medicine, dealing with big stuff with the patients that they were treating. And I grew up in a Unitarian Universalist church in Charleston, West Virginia. So I sort of grew up in the 80s and 90s thinking, well, everybody talks like this. And it was only when I realized people were responding to my journalism that I was asking questions that other people skirted around, or I felt comfortable raising something that, other people might not raise, that I'm like, oh, what is it about me that I feel this comfort going there? And I think, so it's kind of being modeled to not be afraid. And then I think the other big thing was I started out my career as a public radio reporter in newsrooms covering all sorts of things, eventually specialized in politics and covered legislatures and state capitals, and then political campaigns. And I think when you are taught in your 20s to be a political reporter, one of the things you learn is how to shout out the question that the politician is avoiding at the press conference. So that was the other thing that I forged into my identity as a journalist, which is don't wimp out and not ask the question.
Yeah.
And that people who are avoiding things, you need to nudge them towards not avoiding them for the good of all of us, to have an open conversation about what the way forward is.
Fascinating. I mean, on that particular question, I think one of the things that I have experienced spending most of my life, not all, but most of my life in the South, is that there's a sort of presumed politeness to being reticent to go there. to use your language.
Mm-hmm.
So did you never experience a sort of inward reticence to go there? Or was that something you had to learn to push through? Or was it, as you said, just kind of naturally in the water in your experience?
I don't think I don't think of myself as somebody who sort of throws a bomb into the middle of the room, a
Uh-huh.
grenade in the middle of the room. I think for me it was more like I grew up in the kitchens with women in my family
Hmm.
where you really hear some stuff, right? So it was more kind of not recognizing that maybe how different the public sphere was than the private sphere, and instead thinking, when I was forming and originating Death, Sex, and Money with our team, I think one of the things I really wanted to talk about was let's just really get into the stuff that's the most consequential choices and stories in our lives. So that's what I think about is, when you're gossiping with your lady friends in the kitchen, that's what got talked about. So I was like, this is actually worthy of journalistic inquiry. This is serious stuff. So maybe that was kind of a feminist project of sort of bringing the private sphere into the public sphere more.
Yeah. There was a New York Times article that described you as, quote, an observer born into a family of talkers, end quote. And I wondered if you would say that was accurate about yourself.
I I like to joke with my team. I work with these wonderful producers and mix engineers, and I like to joke with them like, you wouldn't believe I'm the quietest member of my family because my work now is, I talk and I edit and I lead discussions and I'm the sort of conductor of it all. But I am, when I'm with my family of origin, maybe one of the quieter ones, who sits back, maybe a little bit more bookish, maybe more writer, kind of more of a writer sensibility where you're watching and observing, rather than being at the center of the breakfast table commanding conversation.
So I wonder if that ever leads you to, do you ever have any sort of resentment about that? Or is that a sort of safe place for you emotionally to have that role in your family?
I think I don't feel sad about it. I think I'm very much a classic middle child. Like I have 3 older sisters and a younger sister and a dad who commands kind of the conversation at the dinner table, aunts and uncles, everybody's a talker and enjoys talking, visiting. And so I think it was just sort of my role. And I remember when I first got into journalism, I learned the kind of the wild privilege you have of getting to call people up and ask them questions to try to understand something more clearly. Then you hang up the phone and then you get to write your version of what everybody's been telling you. It's like it felt both like this, I would use my charm when I was on the phone, and then I would use my I might have a little bit more sass when I'm doing the writing after I've figured out what I think is going on.
Were there moments at which you ever flirted with the, what's the word I'm looking for? The manipulation is way too strong of a term, but it seems to me that that's a sort of power and a capacity that's very easy to abuse.
Yes.
And so what's that been like for you?
I actually think that this took me longer to learn in journalism than it should have. I think my training should have included the second follow-up call where you call all your sources and say, just so you know, here's what the story's going to say.
Oh.
Because, I came up in an era when print newspaper was still king. And so I was mentored by a lot of these, gruff guys with notebooks in their back pocket who were just like, we're the ones who are going to tell you what's really going on. And I don't know. I think there's a certain, it takes courage to be the person to say, to call back and say, I know you told me this thing, but some other people told me this thing. So this is how I'm structured. This is what I'm saying in my story. And I think that that's actually the way that you take care of relationships long term.
Huh. Yeah, that seemed to take a lot of courage to me. What was it that precipitated or led you to take up that habit?
I think I learned it. Well, I remember one time I did a profile of a New York State legislator, and we had a great conversation when I was interviewing him. And then I got into some archival tape, and I discovered that he said the exact opposite of what he was saying to me,
Oh,
5 years before about whether you ought to be working in a bipartisan way or not. So I put that in my story. He's saying this now, but he used to say this. And I got so iced out by that by that politician staff afterwards. And I thought, oh, like it was good that I reported that. It's true. And also, um, I can see why if you're the staff representing that legislator, you think it's a cheap shot from a journalist, you know?
yeah.
And so now I've been making a show for more than 10 years where it's very personal stories. We're talking to people about the most, um, sometimes some quite tender things. And I think it's necessary to loop back around and say, we talked about these things. Here's what we're going to put in the episode. And then I also like, and I don't always have the opportunity to do it, but I like to loop back around later and go like, oh, how did that sit with you when it came out? Like, what did you hear from people in your lives? Just kind of understand when you're telling people stories, that's a real responsibility.
Yeah.
And you can cause some havoc that people don't tell you unless you ask, right? They're just
Right.
like, oh, I'll never talk to a reporter again,
Right. Yeah. In your book, Let's Talk About Hard Things, you frame your project there, opening up, talking about the way in which your divorce from your first marriage played into that. Would you be willing to share that with us?
Sure. I got married when I was 26 to someone I met when I was 22. So I was just finishing college, and we just like found each other right in that clutch moment in your 20s where you're like, who am I? And then you find this person who you really feel like gets you, and you see each other clearly. So it was wonderful to fall in love. And we really sort of pushed each other through our 20s to think about what we wanted to do in the world and encouraged each other and supported each other through that. And we got married at 20. I was 26. He was about 30. And our marriage lasted almost 4 years, during which time we moved to New York City. He changed careers. And we just started like missing what had once been easy to talk about and had once been easy to feel like teammates. It stopped being easy, and we couldn't figure it out. And we asked for help from therapists and counselors, and it was really, really difficult to face that kind of, midway through our young adulthood. What we wanted had started to look pretty different. And also what was difficult for me to face was, I came from a family, my parents are married. My dad had a first marriage before he married my mom. But I grew up in a family where like family is important to me and commitment is important to me. And so it was very difficult to figure out what to do when I started to not be able to see the future for this marriage. I felt a lot of shame. And so we kind of took a while, but eventually figured out, I don't think that this marriage is going to last. And it was after that divorce, and I'm single. I'm like 30, 31 in New York City. I'm a journalist. I never really thought I was going to live in New York City, and all of a sudden I'm living in a studio apartment. And I'm just like, who am I? And what is my life going to be about? And so I began wanting to that's when my research really became me search. I was like, how did people do this? And particularly women, right? Because I'm in my early 30s. I knew I wanted to be a parent. So I had some time pressure to figure this out. if I was going to have my own kids. And so that was the sort of grist that I was dealing with in my personal life when I started toying with the idea of making a show where I'm asking people about death, sex, and money, like how do they make meaning in their lives? How do they take care of their relationships in their lives? How do they support themselves and the people they love? Those are the big themes. And also I was trying to make them all into my guides to figuring out how to rebuild when something, I thought I was going one direction and then that road ended and I had to turn and I didn't know where to turn.
Thank you. What is it that you think makes it so hard for us to have these conversations? I mean, here you are in early 30s in New York City, and you're needing to ask these kinds of questions of yourself. Do you see particular, I know that you've written saying that you think that there are, but what would you say are the contributing factors to it being so difficult to have difficult conversations? What makes them difficult?
Well, I think there can be lots of reasons they're difficult. I mean, first of all, any conversation that, in the case of rebuilding my life after a divorce, I don't want to look clumsy or like I don't know what I'm doing. And especially like when you're in those sort of like tentative moments in life when you're not sure what the next steps are. You don't want to like tell people about that. Other conversations, certainly conversations can be difficult because you have a real difference in values and how you approach something. And you might feel like the person you're talking to is not going to honor where you're coming from, or you might not be able to tolerate where they're coming from. It can be difficult because what was once a relationship where there was connection, there's not anymore. And that's painful to face. And you can talk about the weather and the local sports team as a way of expressing care and not get into the hard things so you don't have to surface what might be difficult.
So let me speculate a moment, see how you'd react to this. So you gave like 3 different examples there, your own experience coming out of divorce and your sense of shame that you're processing. Then you talked about difficult conversations about values and not knowing whether there's going to be shared values and whether or not you would be honored. We wonder whether we'll be honored in our different sets of convictions. Mm-hmm. And then the third example was one in which you may end up lonely or isolated.
Yeah.
And it seems like the common thread among all 3 of those could be reducible simply to shame, that we're afraid of shame that pops up in lots of different ways. Is that a through line? Do you see that as a through line in a lot of this?
I think shame and shame and pain. I think of pain as a little bit different than shame. Maybe shame is there's parts of me that I don't want to be seen clearly, or I'm afraid will be seen clearly. And there's something different where it's like, I wish this could be different and I can't make it so, which can be pain, right? Like I wish my relationship with this old friend was what it used to be and I can't make it so because something fundamental shifted or we're seeing something differently. That's not necessarily shame.
Right.
That's sadness. That's grief.
Yeah. Earlier you said that you were raised in the Unitarian Universalist Church. In what way has that tradition informed you or not? And or are there other faith traditions, religious, philosophical traditions that have informed your way in the world and asking these kinds of questions or making space for these kinds of conversations?
I loved growing up a UU, and I grew up a UU in West Virginia. So that's kind of a specific way to grow up UU, right?
Probably different than growing up UU in Connecticut, I guess.
Yeah, or Boston or Berkeley, where I live now, where UU values and the way that you're encouraged to think about everybody kind of being able to figure out their own journey, like that's part of the macro culture in Berkeley, where I live now, or maybe in New England, where Unitarianism has this sort of like it kind of has a 19th century tradition there. People are from, you don't have to explain when you say
Yeah.
I'm a UU. When you're a UU in West Virginia, you're like, basically what the deal is we think whatever you believe is okay, but we want to gather for church together because we believe in community. And I grew up, my church was founded by, where I grew up in West Virginia, in the Kanawha Valley, it had been sort of a big chemical industry kind of when I was growing up. That was still sort of going gangbusters. And so all these engineers had moved to town from elsewhere who were atheists. And they'd started this Unitarian society that grew into the church where I grew up. And so it was this mix of atheist engineers and then a lot of women who were part of the women's movement in the 70s. And then I grew up in the 80s and 90s kind of thinking this is like what the world is. This is like natural. You go to religious education Sunday school and you learn about the religions of the world, or you learn about Martin Luther King's speech, or letter from the Birmingham jail. Like it was like, we are going to talk about values and different faith traditions, and we're going to encourage you to understand that there's a lot of people coming from a lot of different places. And then the key number, there's something like 7 or 8 principles that the Unitarian Universalist Association has identified as something we can agree on if we're UUs. And the first one is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And I think about that all the time. And I think about that in my personal politics. I think about that in how I teach etiquette to my children. I think about that in my journalistic curiosity. Because if you really are committed to thinking about the inherent worth and dignity of every person, then that's quite a challenge, particularly in our polarized times where we want to think about how we're all dignified and worthy, and there's plenty of other people on the other side who aren't.
Let's turn to getting you to teach us some skills, say, of facilitating such conversations. You said at one point, the chief skill in any conversation is how you listen. So unpack that for us a bit.
Oh, I think of it as it's just how you're establishing the invitation to share, right? Like it's if you are entering into what you suspect might be a difficult or charged conversation, you want to first. I think it's important to say like, I want to talk about something that might be difficult, or I've been thinking about something and I want to talk to you about something important, just so they can be prepared. Your conversation partner can be prepared to enter into a different rhythm. And then how you establish your listening, it communicates to the person, like, this is what my intention is in this conversation. I want to talk about this because I want to exchange information. And how you listen either invite someone to share more, or if you kind of feel yourself reacting and you interject because you need to establish a different set of assumptions or something, you're not gonna have that back and forth, which is necessary in a hard conversation, right? Like, if your goal is to see each other more clearly.
What would you say? You concluded there by saying, if your goal is to see one another more clearly. What would you say are some of the common? I mean, I think I could make some up, but from what you see, what are some of the ways? What are some of the alternative goals of conversations that trip people up, where you end up being more alienated as opposed to seeing one another more clearly?
Well, I will give you an example of hard conversation. I have remarried, and I've been married for 10 years, and I have hard conversations with my husband all the time. And when we are less successful, when I am less successful in a hard conversation, It's when I maybe um, when my chief focus is, you better listen to what my experience of this is, and I need you to hear it. And certainly, like, that is usually at least one of my goals in a hard conversation. I want you to understand what my experience is. I want to feel heard. But if my chief concern is that, it's a battle, right? And I have the great fortune of being married to somebody who is very smart, very quick. He's even faster at logic than I am. So if that's the way that we're gonna talk, it's not gonna work. If I can instead, this is over many years of marriage, if I can instead, like, remember, we are part of the same enterprise here. And if I'm irritated about pickup with our kids going one way or drop off, it's always these small things, the reason something can get inflamed is because one or both of us is feeling either underappreciated or like we didn't do enough, and we feel sad about that because we really care about our family, right?
Yeah.
So if that can be, if I can take deep breaths and make space for that understanding as we talk about logistics or whatever, it's always more successful.
Yeah, that reminds me of one time when my wife and I were, we've done several rounds of marriage therapy. And in one of those rounds of marriage therapy, I remember the therapist talking about a problem. You've got a shared problem. And she said, you can either put the problem between you and you're talking at each other about that problem that's between you, or you can put the problem out there and both of you turn your attention to the problem and work on the problem together. And I just thought that was a super helpful, sort of simple framing.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yes. The other thing that I am just coming around to is I've got kids, they're 9 and 6. And as any mom who does elementary school pickup knows, like, the person that you love the most is the person you take all your frustrations out of.
Yeah, sure.
At the end of a long day. And so having a tired 6-year-old has helped me also realize sometimes I think I'm talking about a problem with my husband. But in fact, we're really talking about how we're tired and worn out and frustrated about how something went earlier in the day. Yeah. And now we're arguing about something, small.
Yeah. What other skills or rules of thumb for broaching hard conversations?
I really think listening is a way to think about it. If you're a head thinker, if you're like a musical thinker, I am helped by thinking about pacing and rhythm. Because if you think about the hard conversations that kind of have unfurled, successfully in your life, maybe you were on a road trip, maybe you were on a walk, maybe you gave something time, one of you said something and then the other took a moment to take it in. Like, I just think pacing and quiet, like letting it unfold, is often a key to a more successful conversation than something that's more like, or if you're not from a family where there's, where that's the pace, where I have a friend who described, she was like, my family of origin was not passive aggressive, it was massive aggressive. So there's that kind of dealing with difficult conversations where you get loud and animated and maybe yell. And, there's other ways of dealing with difficult conversations where you shut it out. Well, isn't that okay? Move on. And that's where it's too slow. It slows to a pace where you don't actually get anything done.
Yeah.
I also think, I think about when I've had some of the best close conversations with people in my life that I love, and it's also, maybe I didn't go into it thinking it was going to be a hard conversation, but just taking that minute to go, like, how is it going right now? I think about, I have a lot of people in my life who who are aging, and some have lost partners, and figuring out how you acknowledge something, a big loss. Like, how do you talk about grief with someone who is a proud woman, who lost her partner of 60 years without taking away her dignity, right?
Right.
So I find myself, I have a good friend. I'm like, how are you? So tell me about your days. Like, when, I know you take your afternoon nap. Like, what do you do? How are you spending most of your late mornings? What are you up to? And just kind of asking about just concrete things. And then you hear if books are being read, or who she's talking to on the phone, or how the quiet feels in the house, that kind of thing.
That's lovely. You said at one point that you think the most difficult part is when to speak up and make yourself heard. And you go on and say it's nerve-wracking to claim the space to say something you've been silent about for years. But when you put off speaking up because it might upset someone else, you are putting their comfort ahead of what you need.
Mm-hmm.
Is that autobiographical for you?
Sometimes. And sometimes not. I hear that. And I guess I would put an asterisk on that sentence. That can be so true. If you have something in the pit of your stomach that has been silenced, a secret you're holding, or a resentment you're carrying, that can be so true that you are not served by just lugging that around and not letting the other person know. It can also be true that every time is not the right time to have that conversation,
Right.
So I think of it like it's so much about, I guess if you think about it like if you have information to share that's going to change what somebody else knows to be true in their world, if it's somebody in your family or somebody that you work with, or that you have something that's going to reorder their world. We all have maybe received information like that. It is a lot to take in, right? And so I think that when you are disclosing something or bringing up something that could be upsetting, it's holding both of those things being true. I need to say this to honor myself and not to prioritize the comfort of somebody else. And also, I need to recognize that can be upsetting, and it might take a little time.
Yeah.
It might be more than one conversation. It might be many conversations.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the way that I would think of it. Like, but I do think being on the other side of not holding something back, it's beautiful when you are in a relationship that you let there be more truth inside of once you've worked through that.
Yeah. I think for me, I don't know if this is true, this is me armchair psychologizing, but at least the narrative I've told myself about my extended family is that my grandmother's father killed himself. And she then, whenever any topic arose that made her uncomfortable, she would just say nothing and quickly change the topic of conversation. And then I think, that's kind of how my father often was, and the extended camp family was. And it was often not layered with, it was often a genuine sort of, we're nice, and we this is one of the ways we're nice, is that we don't talk about hard stuff. And then at some point, my area is kind of moral philosophy, but as I was thinking about some of the virtues one time, it occurred to me that that can be an exhibition of patience, where you wait, right? Everything can't be said all the time, everywhere, and you need to wait and be patient. But then it occurred to me one day that there comes a point at which it's no longer patience, and now it becomes cowardice, for example. But how would you think about navigating? When does patience become cowardice, or when do you try to make those kinds of judgments? You think?
I mean, I think that's such a like, I'm picturing a line, like at a certain point it tilts. You're not avoiding because you're being loving and patient. You're avoiding because you're afraid.
Yeah.
And I think it's a spectrum. And I also think, in that example, like, who is the patient serving? Like, I think sometimes of it, like, just to go back to the example of grief, if you're talking to somebody who's lost someone, there are people who avoid, and we talk about how are you? You look great. Move on to the next thing. And then there are the people who, like, will say, like, oh, I was just thinking about him the other day, and share a memory of somebody who's passed, right? And I've learned so much by watching the grace with which people can do that. Bring up something that could be, a little outside the edges of what feels light and breezy. And then, when you share a memory, you're saying, like, I know you miss him,
Right.
Or, I think of, in the case of suicide, in my family, we, my father's side, were related to Meriwether Lewis, the explorer. And my kids are learning about Lewis and Clark. And there's Meriwether Lewis most probably died by suicide. And it's been interesting to think about how to talk about that with my kids. He died young. And melancholy is the word that gets used at the time. We talk about, he also he did all of these things, and also he had the blues. Who else in our life has the blues? And just introduce this idea that there are some people, to a greater extent than others, who carry around depression and the blues, and to let somebody they're learning about in history class, like, be one of those people who also had the blues. Like, there's something cool about modeling that both of those things certainly can be true.
Yeah. So that's a helpful segue into thinking about money, sex, and death.
Is it?
Yeah. So tell us more about, when you think about just navigating conversations around death, what would be kind of key takeaways from all these conversations you've had about things that you wish more people would consider in talking about death?
Well, I think when we talk about death, there is the idea of talking to people who are in grief, who are left with a loss, and then there is the reality of all of our deaths. And I will tell you, as I age, talking about the reality of all of our own deaths gets harder and harder. It's more tender for me now that I'm in my mid-40s. I just think, when I was writing the book, I was thinking, like, what kind of deaths? Who do I want to talk to about what has comforted them around death? And I ended up talking to a friend in her 80s about how she is noticing her own deterioration and what that's like, and how she appreciates when someone offers an arm, so that she can take gently, but not overdo it, so she doesn't feel pitiful or pitied. I talked to a dear friend of mine I grew up with who experienced a pregnancy loss in her second trimester, towards the end of her second trimester, and just that the kind of loss that feels excruciating to you, and that can be not a lot of readily available ritual to recognize it. And she told me about how she's created her own rituals in her family. She takes her kids who were born after this first child, and they get an ice cream cake on the anniversary of their big brother's birth and death every year. And it's part of the family culture acknowledging that this happened. And, I also think I talked about my own experience, like being at my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary party. My great uncle collapsed and eventually died of a heart attack, and so we were all there, his whole extended family, and they live in a farming community, and we knew which church we were going to go to. We knew who would bring what in the community hall for the food. It was a terrible loss. And also, I, as a teenager, got to see the way that family and community and rituals hold us when we're experiencing that loss together. And how different that is in my life now, where I live very far from most of my family that I grew up with. I don't have a community hall where I know people would gather to mark my death, and just how in the absence of that ritual, like how in my life now do I want to acknowledge when a fellow mom at elementary school, if they lose a parent, what do I do? How do I talk about it? Because when you're not in a community that's organized where the rituals are sort of more automatic or inherited, I've got to figure out what to say, right? I have to figure out, am I going to text? Am I going to call? Will I take a covered dish? What is my way of acknowledging this? So there's all sorts of hard questions around death. And how do we talk about it?
Yeah. You said a moment ago that as you're now into your 40s, that there's an increased level of tenderness in that consideration. What are kind of some of the specifics for you as you think about? Are you thinking there about your own death or death of loved ones, or what specifically do you experience as more tender now?
Oh, all of the above, right? I think when you're a young person, even if you're a young person who's had loss, the big idea of death is something that happens to old people, and you're not an old person. And then as you become older, it happens to people you don't think of as who are near death, right? Or it happens to people who get illness out of the blue or in accidents or so I think of how do I think of? I think I am getting clearer as I get older about what is the just incredible marrow of life. Like what is the most important thing about living and breathing on this planet. And I am more and more aware of its fleetingness, right?
Right.
And this isn't a new thought. The problem with writing a book about death, sex, and money and talking about it is basically you figure out every book that's ever been written is kind of working on
about death, sex, and money.
Maybe one or all of those themes too.
Yeah, I mean, what else is there to talk about, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm in my 50s, and I've definitely found myself it's been more in the last 5 years, I think, much more aware of my death. I mean, statistically for me, and given my family and genetics on both sides, all things being equal, I'm probably going to live until my late 80s, early 90s. But I'm always aware of the fact that, I could be dead next week. I could, and I do think for me with age that just more naturally arises. And then also having people my age that I've known or know now die. And with our podcast, No Small Endeavor, several years ago, I had a friend named Clay, and Clay got diagnosed with very serious cancer. And I talked with some of my other friends, and at school over lunch one day, and I have a friend who's a lit professor, English lit professor, and so I was asking them. I said, I've got this curiosity or wondering if I should ask this friend if he would be willing to sit with me over the next year, because he thought he had about a year left to live. If he would sit with me on several occasions and just talk about it. And my friend, the lit professor, he said, they used to have these death manuals in the Middle Ages where that's what they did, is they taught you how to think about death, and they taught you how to die well.
Yeah.
And I just thought, what? I've never heard of such a thing, And so anyway, they encouraged me to ask my friend, and he said yes. And it was this beautiful experience. And so we sat 3 times, and a lot of conversation, a good number of hours of tape. And, but yeah, I think that changed me in important ways, especially because what I learned from him was that day is coming for all of us, right? And so then the question is, how intentional am I going to be with my days in light of my mortality and in light of my coming death? And it doesn't have to be this kind of morbid thing. It's just a fact. This is what we all got, right? And so we can allow that to become this source of inspiration for how we want to live our lives, how we want to show up to the people that we love, how we want to show up to seeing life as an adventure and so forth. So yeah, I think for me, that was one of those places where I saw explicitly talking about death can be such a liberating practice.
Yeah. And it becomes, I don't know that it's still, when you're talking to someone who's dying, it does not make it easier when they're gone.
Right.
Like the hole is still there. You do, however, have so much, information and relational memories that you can go back to, right? Just and when you're dying, that can be a lonely thing because that freaks a lot of people out. They disappear, So to ask your friend, I mean, what a loving, I bet that was scary to say, can I record with you? Can we face this together? But what a gift.
It certainly was to me. Sex.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, I will just say, being raised in the Bible Belt and Bible Belt purity culture, even as a fairly, I think these days at least, a reasonably well-adjusted adult, to have such conversations in public is like, what? So help us out here. How do you have conversations about sex in public that you're clearly not in the lurid, stuff, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I like to ask people about how they, what's romance like in your life now? I talk about romance. I'll ask about what was it like to learn how to be close to this person? I'll ask questions about kind of intimacy and romance because those are great stories to hear about when you got swept up in the miracle of feeling connected to someone. And I also like hearing people talk about like living in our bodies. And I think the way that we, for example, I was having kids while I was making this show. So dealing with anxieties about fertility or, the stress of pregnancies or how to have a baby and where, there's a lot of things that my peers in my 30s, we were all sort of figuring out on our own and, one-on-one and like, why not? There's nothing to be, I didn't feel any shame about desperately wanting to be a parent and also what to do with all the questions that led to, right? About how to do it, and then talk with people who had difficulty getting pregnant, et cetera. So I don't. I think that our skittishness around sex can make make us avoid things that can be so much where we need help figuring out. We need help figuring out how to feel safe with somebody else that we love, but also, you mentioned purity culture. Like, what does that mean? How much of myself do I get to bring into this relationship? What are the parts of me that like want to connect? So I don't know. I think it's kind of, maybe this is the part of me that's a little bit of a you rebel, where I'm like, come on, talk about it. We don't have to get graphic. Because I think it's really about, to me, and it's like, how do you, when I'm talking about conversations about sex, it's about, isn't it amazing that we have love in this world? And one way that we love one another is in, our relationships, our romantic relationships, and figuring out all the ways that we can love each other. Just kind of, that's fun to talk about.
Yeah. I don't remember where I read this, but if it was a description of one of your episodes or in your book, but you were talking about kind of the continuum between kind of purity culture stuff, and then you used the phrase on the other end, militantly sex positive. And I'd never heard that phrase, militantly sex positive. You may have invented that, and I'm going to remember that phrase. But it's like, that's the trick, isn't it? It's like both of those seem to be quite unhelpful. Both ends of the spectrum seem to be quite unhelpful, because I think all of us realize that, one, we are embodied creatures. We are sexual creatures. And then there's a whole lot of complexity in figuring out how we live into that in a way that flourishes.
Yes.
That requires boundaries, that requires discipline, that requires freedom, that requires authenticity, all of that. That's a pretty complicated kind of mix, right?
Yes. I think, going back to shame, how do you convey, and I think about this as a parent, how do you convey to somebody who's going to come of age, it is amazing that you get to live in a body. It is also something that is precious, and some measure of protection, emotional protection and physical protection, is a part of honoring your body. And I haven't had to do that yet. My kids are still young, but I think that you're right. Like, I think what I was getting at with militant sex positivity is, like, in my experience, I happen to believe that, like, sharing our bodies with each other and the ways that we figure out how to feel safe around that, like that, it takes a lot of care, and it is not low stakes. And so I think that it's not no big deal. And so figuring out how you can honor whatever lots of people have lots of different value systems around how they approach sex and partners. But I think that we can all agree it's not low stakes.
Yeah. Right. Other big takeaways from having conversations about sex that...
Let's see. Other big takeaways. The other thing I really liked, I remember interviewing a woman who had gone through cancer treatment, breast cancer treatment, and just about getting back in her body after that experience. And I think that sometimes we think of, if you happen to be in a long-term relationship that's monogamous, it's sort of like you figure out how you relate, and then that's just what it's going to be. In fact, that's not the case. Like, as our bodies change, as we go through illness, as we age, like it's how we feel in our body, whether we want to be seen, all of that changes. So it's something can be a continual conversation. It doesn't have to be epic, but just like, this doesn't feel, I'm in this thing because I'm figuring out this now. My body's changing in this way, sharing that in a partnership can be really illuminating, because when we don't have those conversations, especially if you're in a monogamous relationship with two people, like if something changes for the other partner and they don't explain what's going on,
Right.
you can make a lot of assumptions about it having to do with you when it could be something they're going through.
It seems like in one way, that phrase you use there of it doesn't have to be epic. Is that one of the things that you're kind of helping us with? That is that if we will get better at having these kinds of conversations, we'll realize that a lot of our experience is not really so unique, that we're really kind of dealing with a lot of common human experience, and it's better shared.
Yes, I think that my book is called Let's Talk About Hard Things, and I think often the emphasis can be about hard things.
Yeah.
Let's talk about hard. And in fact, the real emphasis of the book is let's.
Yeah.
Let's try.
Yeah. Money. All right. So
Okay.
why do you think money's so hard to talk about?
I mean, it's another one where shame can get ignited from any direction, whether you feel like you don't have what you ought to, or what people think you do, or you have more than you think you have earned. That can be a source of shame. It can be really difficult if you're talking actual dollars and cents. Those conversations can be so hard because it's so difficult to know who in our lives we can share like a common reference point, right? Like, I can remember when early parenthood in a city where your family's not living near you. That was my experience. It was like all of a sudden I had to figure out all the things that babies cost and childcare cost and how people found it, how people figured it out. And it's a huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
And I had to figure out who were kind of maybe the colleagues who had little kids, or who were the moms at the playground. Who could you start that tentative conversation with to be like, so did you decide to do a nanny or daycare, and why? And all of that has major dollar sign differentials. So it can be just, that's one reason it's hard among many, many others.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even as you're saying that, I mean, I'm flashing back to when, my wife and I are both from upper middle class families. And then when we decided to take some of the routes that we took vocationally in our 20s and early 30s, we were quite strapped. And, even on women, infants, and children to buy milk for our kids, because I'm in graduate school, my wife's working hard at a job, trying to also take care of kids. And, we didn't have anything, and didn't have insurance for a long while. We had our first two babies without insurance. And so it's a very different experience to be embarrassingly asked about what is this going to cost at the hospital. The hospitals are not set up for that, and they don't know. Right. And so all of the kind of embarrassment and shame around that kind of stuff, I hadn't thought about that in quite some while, but that kind of stuff can just feel so heavy, and you don't want to go talk about it with people, and you especially don't want to talk about it with people who have a whole lot more money, right? And then as well, another thing I just flashed back to was after we'd moved back to Nashville, I remember I knew this guy that was quite wealthy. And as I recollect the story, our kids had been over because of another connection at his house, swimming maybe, and he had I remember the kids talking about that he had a whole bunch of ice cream bars in the freezer at the pool or something like that. And so we were pulling out of a Mexican restaurant one night, and I saw this friend, and I rolled the window down, we started talking. And so David, our middle son, was in the back listening. And I said, David, this is so-and-so where you went swimming the other day. And David rolled his window down, and he leaned out the car, and he looked at the guy, and he said, "You are rich." and as soon as we pulled away, I kid you not, I rolled up the window, as soon as we pulled away, I said, "David, don't ever do that again." But I thought, I'm a theologian. I know we should be talking about money, right? But this sort of, I don't know, there's just something about this culture where it's like, you don't do that. Don't do that. So it's fascinating, to help us say, yeah, let's do that.
Is David a podcast host now also? I don't teach my children to shout that out of their car windows.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's like, I grew up in a family in West Virginia. My dad was an orthopedic surgeon. My mom was a physical therapist. We had money. We lived on the top of the hill. Like, I went to the public school on the top of the hill with all the other fancy kids. And so in my family of origin, like the way we talked about money was, don't you know how fortunate you are? Don't you know? Like, it was kind of like, we are going to acknowledge the differential, and also like, you are at the top of the heap. And then I left West Virginia for college, and I was shocked to realize that as a rich kid, there were much richer kids out there.
That you were just down on a foothill.
Yes.
You were not on the top of the hill. Yeah.
So I think it is so kind of tricky. And I was raising kids. I am raising kids in Berkeley, where there's a lot of visible homelessness. And how do you talk about homelessness? And how do you talk about the root causes of homelessness and there not being enough houses for people? Because they ask, right? And then, so there's the conversations I have with my children, and I might use words with them that I wouldn't use at a podcast when I'm explaining. I can be more kind of just explicit with them about money than I would be in public. And there's some reasons I understand for that and some reasons I don't. But I think that money conversations, there's like talking about who has more and who has less. There's also how we talk about our very different value systems around what money is for. I think because we don't really have often a lot of fluency around just money in general, it can be difficult to realize that some of your baseline assumptions around money can be quite different from somebody else. Like in my family, you buy things on sale if it's available on sale, and because money is for saving. And then my husband, he likes to buy a really nice, sweater. And I'm like, how much is that sweater? And then I have come to appreciate buying, investing into one nice sweater every few years, but it was not automatic for me. So we had to figure out, we are coming at this from some different assumptions about money.
Yeah, the family of origin stuff around money is fascinating. I mean, there's another occasion I remember from marriage therapy one time where the counselor one day said, Lee, let me get this straight. You're from a family of accountants. Your father, your grandfather, your uncle, your cousin, your brother are all accountants, and there was always concern about where everything was spent. And I said, yes. And she said, Lauren, let me get this straight. Your father was raised poor, and now he has money, and the way he shows love is by extravagant spending. And Laura said, yes. And she looked at us and she said, don't you get it? And I was like, well, I never had until now. And now I do. Yes. And it's just, these kind of deeply embedded experiences that shape us. And until somebody helps us see it, or we lean into ourselves and begin to explore it, it can just be so devastating until you then begin to say, okay, let's explore how we can make sense of these different ways of thinking about these things.
Yeah, and that they can both be right and they can both be moral, know, because I can maybe suspect that my husband, I get where he comes from, but obviously mine is the more morally correct view around money. Like, no, like showing love by sharing and with generosity, there's a real virtue in that,
Yeah, yeah. Two quick things as we close. The first one being, are there any hard conversations you find yourself avoiding these days?
Oh. I mean, yes. What's an example? What do I find myself avoiding? I think living in the world in this moment, I think one thing I am struggling with is I feel like the part of my consciousness that reads the news, and then the part of my consciousness that is with my family and in my work, there's such a disconnect because I'm in a moment of deep satisfaction and love and comfort in my family. And then when I pick up my eyes to read headlines, I feel horrified and scared and uncertain, and about feeling like I'm in an era of history that is unfamiliar to me. And maybe this is part of being in your 40s, where you realize like the era you were born in was actually a specific historical consequence and not just like reality. But I feel like we are in an era that is unfamiliar to me, and I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how much of the explosive material that's out there is going to blow as far as our democracy and our ability to be a country together. So I struggle with how to talk about that, because you can talk about it one way where you're sort of presuming shared political viewpoints over whatever at a dinner party, but I don't really want to talk about the headlines. I want to talk about how are we living in this moment? And what are we doing? How are we tending to one another? So that's difficult.
Yeah.
For me right now.
To close then, would you give us perhaps one or two, somebody's listening and they say, yeah, okay, let's. What's some encouragement or a possibility for a next step as somebody wants to say, yeah, okay, let's.
Let's. I love that. Something I do a lot in interviews that I like, I think it's effective, is I will say to somebody, I'll do my research of questions and I'll come up with like maybe this is what's happened here. Maybe they're living their life this way because of this fact about something in their past. And so I'll structure the sentence something like, I might not have this right, but I'm wondering, I noticed that this happened in this, and I'm wondering if you think that made this happen, or it made you like this because of this. And what I'm trying to say is the idea where you're indicating to somebody, I've been thinking about you. I might not be right in what some of the guesses I have about what's going on with you, but I'm wondering if I'm right, and I want to talk about it. And also embedded in that structure is saying, like, you can say, no, you've got that all wrong. In fact, this other thing that you didn't know about. And the base of that is like wanting to connect and leading with curiosity, right? Like, I want to know, I want to be with you in a deeper way than we have been. And so you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can just call up somebody and say, I've been thinking about you. I thought of this memory. Like, how are you doing? And maybe even just the tone of your voice can lead to a different sort of conversation than you might have otherwise had. But it's kind of, when you take that extra 30 seconds to just see if you might have a different sort of conversation, those are the conversations you'll remember for the rest of your life.
Talking to Anna Sale, the creator and host of Death, Sex, and Money, a podcast about the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. And she's also the author of Let's Talk About Hard Things. Anna, it's been a lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.